Coming up on Wrestling Life.
Personally, I was happy to be a part of that because, like yourself, I sort of have the mindset that there's enough negativity out there when it comes to wrestling and the content that's produced about it. That's not to say it can't be entertaining at times, but how nice is it to actually end up a story on a happy note, right? The final chapter wasn't, well, my life's in ruins. It was, I'm in my late 60s and I'm looking forward to what's coming ahead. And I just think that's really refreshing, especially in this day and age.
Welcome to Wrestling Life with Ben Veal, the show that features real talk from real talent.
Welcome everyone to today's show. I am Ben Veal, and joining me in the Wrestling Life studio today is the author of one of the best and undoubtedly most heavily researched wrestling books that I've ever read. NITRO, The Incredible and Inevitable Collapse of Ted Turner's WCW, goes into astonishing levels of detail about the true story of World Championship Wrestling. And its author, Guy Evans, did such a thorough job with telling the promotion story in a fair, balanced and impartial way that he was then entrusted by Eric Bischoff to support him with the writing of his second autobiography, Grateful. I'm so pleased, looking forward to diving into this with Guy. How are you today, Guy? Thanks for your time.
I'm doing great, Ben. Thanks so much for having me on.
Recording this in 2024, arguably wrestling is at its hottest now since the Monday Night War era, would you say?
I think you would probably, be accurate in making that statement. I mean, you could say technically that perhaps in the years that followed, when it sort of started its metronomic decline, things arguably may have been hotter when things were kind of starting the downturn. But certainly, if you think back to 2018, when this book was originally published, I think the sentiment at that time was, it's hard to conceive of another period that could in any way approximate what we saw in the mid to late 90s or before that in the 80s. Wrestling is just sort of destined to be in this state of affairs now where there's one dominant company and they have a monopoly, and the creative's probably not going to be very good, and the programming as a whole is not going to be very inspired. And then obviously quite a lot has changed since then, and so it's really nice to see that there's that old cliche, of course, about wrestling being a cyclical business. But it appears that the cycle has come back around. And, if you look at those attendance figures and the general sort of interest in wrestling at the moment, and look at what WWE did just the other day in Australia, it's really quite remarkable, what they're doing and how they've transitioned out of that, really long sort of hangover period from the Monday Night Wars, where it was almost like, many of the stars who were integral at the time were still hanging on and were involved in some form or fashion, and you couldn't really see how they were going to transition to this new era. But they've done that now. You look at a typical card and you'll see, people that just 4 or 5 years ago, in most cases, you couldn't necessarily imagine being featured so heavily on the programming. So yeah, it's a really good time for the business, and I think really interesting to see what 2024 brings as well.
Yeah, I mean, by the time this episode goes out, I'll have been to Philly and we'll have had WrestleMania. But to think that we've got a WrestleMania where you've got headlining the show people like Drew McIntyre, Cody Rhodes, Rhea Ripley, Bayley, and then if you went back 5 or 6 years ago, that wouldn't have seemed imaginable. So you're right, there's still that reliance on the old guard to a degree.
Right.
But there's been an incredible investment, hasn't there, in actually building the new breed, which to me relates a little bit to that late 90s kind of Attitude Era where it was The Rock and Stone Cold and Triple H and Mankind, lots of not necessarily homegrown talents, but talents that really found their voice and their niche in that period of WWF.
Yeah, I think the difference now is you have some of these nostalgic acts or legends of the past who are being brought in to supplement the business that they're already doing as a special attraction. The Rock, for example, as opposed to the case just a few years ago where it appeared that a lot of times these people were being brought in to actually save, an upcoming pay-per-view event or to bring the television numbers up from continuing to decline. And so now it appears that, it's kind of the cherry on top of the sundae when you can incorporate, a Dwayne Johnson into your programming. So again, it's great to see. I, like many other people, I think, it was hard not to reach a conclusion at one point that we were just going to continue this period of the audience falling off year after year. And again, if you look at the television numbers, they still in no way come close to the raw interest that was present back in the 90s. And we could go into a whole long discussion about that and all of the changes that have taken place since then, and with respect to technology and how people digest content, and we won't go down that road. But the point that I'm trying to make is there still remains a lot of upside, I think, even when you consider, as I said, the business they just did in Australia, the interest around WrestleMania, obviously AEW, selling out Wembley. But there's still, a long way to go, I think, a long way to go before we could say wrestling is back in another boom period. But it's definitely, the business is definitely heading in the right direction.
So talking of boom periods, I mean, you mentioned it at the start. I mean, your book came out in 2018, which in the world of literature is a long, long time. Yet actually, it feels like your book's having a real resurgence. I mean, we were speaking off air. I read it a few months ago and absolutely fell in love with this book. The book I'm referring to is this weighty tome of NITRO, the new expanded edition. I mean, it's been so well received, Guy, not only by fans, but also by kind of many of those that work in the industry at the time and were there through that period. What do you feel is the key to the success of NITRO?
Yeah, it's funny that you say that, because I've observed the exact same thing. In the last year or so, the book has, sort of taken on another life. And, I've actually made this observation several times over the years. That there's been so many periods where, for whatever reason, someone will talk about the book on a podcast, it'll get mentioned somewhere. A notable person in the world of wrestling will discuss it on social media, and all of a sudden that will give it another life for a number of months, or at this point we're talking about years. And it never ceases to amaze me, how many people this book has reached, and how much of an effect I think it's made in this particular world of wrestling literature, if you like. I think a lot of it, quite frankly, has to do with, to answer your question, the people who were interviewed for the project first and foremost, because without and pick the name really, without an Eric Bischoff or a Jamie Kellner who's quoted in the book, or a Harvey Schiller or Vince Russo or Kevin Sullivan, Kevin Nash, any big name that you want to mention, without those people having their perspective included in the book, of course, there would have been several gaping holes there, right? If everyone's talking about Eric Bischoff, for example, constantly throughout the chapters, but we never actually hear from Eric himself, that would probably limit the effectiveness of the story. So I would say that. I would also say timing had a lot to do with it, because the book came out initially, although, as you mentioned, we reissued the book in 2021 with the hardcover edition, the expanded edition, but the book came out at a time when a number of those people were actually available for interviews, because there was a period after the Monday Night Wars where a lot of the key sort of principal subjects were either not talking, or they were under contract to WWE, or they were under contract to TNA at the time. So that is to say, the book probably couldn't have been made in, let's say, 2005, 2006, right? It was almost like enough time had to go by to where a lot of the key subjects were available. And also enough time had to go by for people to sort of put into context what this whole phenomena actually was, as it relates to WCW and the Monday Night Wars more generally. And of course, in the immediate aftermath of the company closing down, there was just so much negativity, and rightfully so, really, about WCW, based in large part on the fact that the last 18 months to 2 years of the programming was just like a fever dream. And so people just were sort of in disbelief at how quickly this whole thing imploded, and the fashion in which it did. But I think by 2017, 2018, enough time had gone by where, keep in mind the network had just been launched a few years prior. People had a chance to go back, watch the old shows, and actually say, you know what, the last 18 months or so was crazy, but this company actually did some amazing things. And at its peak, NITRO in particular was a phenomenal program. And so, I think it's a number of things, but I always give the credit to those people who took part. And again, give credit to luck and timing having a lot to do with it. And then finally, I would just say, I think what makes any creative endeavor impactful, and you probably find this in terms of what you're doing as well, Ben, is just having a genuine curiosity about the subject and an honest desire to try to do it the right way. And that's how I approach the book as well. As you mentioned, this thing is a beast, right? It's 550, 600 pages. I wasn't going to devote all of this time to writing about something that I didn't care about. So I think the fact that, I came into the project with a genuine desire to answer some of these questions that myself and a lot of other fans from back then had, and present something new as it related to the WCW story, that's really what propelled it, I think, to have the impact it did.
But I mean, there's already so many, there are already a number of documentaries out there about the Monday Night Wars. There are already books written about WCW. There's already a plethora of wrestling autobiographies out there. So where did you see a gap was in terms of the untold story that you wanted to tell?
I think there was if people have read the book, they'll see that there are many, many, many new elements that are introduced to the story as a result of the NITRO book coming out. I mean, even starting with the way that NITRO became a television program in the first place, right? We've all heard the story of Eric Bischoff having the meeting with Ted Turner and kind of blurting out that, hey, we need to go prime time with Vince. But, there was a meeting before that meeting, which has never been told. So that's just one example of, something I think people don't know about. Of course, the way that the WCW sale ended up, there's always been a lot of ambiguity as it relates to that. How did the programs get cancelled? What was the motivation behind it? Who was making those decisions? What options did they have available to them at the time? What incentives were in place? And by consequence, how did those incentives inform their decision? And there's a tremendous amount of detail on aspects like that. And I think I found it rather curious over the years, although I did enjoy a lot of the documentaries and books that you talked about. I always found it quite curious that we never actually got to hear from some of these, I call them shadowy figures, that would often come up in these accounts, the Jamie Kellners of the world, the Harvey Schillers. We were always told that they were important power players and people who really had a lot to do with ultimately what happened to WCW. But we never really actually got to hear from these people. And so, in this book, On the Record, you get a chance to hear from their perspective what was going on. And so, I think the book really, the way that I see it, it's the story of this dysfunctional relationship between WCW and its parent company, Turner Broadcasting. It is a story about a wrestling company, but it's more so about how this wrestling company fit or didn't fit within the wider portfolio of this corporate behemoth, which was Turner. And I think a lot of the most interesting, most comedic, most thought-provoking content really comes from exploring that dynamic. So it's a very different book in all of those ways and more, I would say.
And I think what makes it very special, as you say, I mean, it's very well put together, and it's I say this as a writer and journalist, it's a fantastic piece of writing. But what makes it special is the fact that you've got these 120 odd interviews with all these different people that you mention, and some of those names within the wrestling world you're talking about, kind of Kevin Sullivan, Kevin Nash, Eric Bischoff. I mean, these are not people that typically you would expect would be that keen to go on the record about some of this stuff. Did you find that in the early days that you faced some reluctance in terms of people wanting to open up with you for the book?
I can't say that I did, quite honestly. Very few people who I had the chance to get on the phone with declined. Probably I could count them on one hand, to be honest with you. And ultimately that didn't end up affecting the story too much. I think that, when you're stepping into a world like this, and what I mean by that is, we don't always see this as wrestling fans, but when you think about any company, and WCW is no exception, yes, we think about the characters, yes, we think about the performers, but there was a whole staff of people who were involved in putting the shows on the air. And, these people are still in contact with one another. They still remember their time in the business. They're still approached from time to time about getting involved in different projects. And so the reason I bring that up is I knew that word was going to spread when I started reaching out to those people initially, that hey, there's this random British guy who's working on a book about WCW, and let's kind of keep each other updated as to what our impressions are. And I think once I had a chance to conduct those first few interviews, and people saw that, and again, you have to be honest as a human being. No one is without some kind of a bias. No one can not be influenced in any way by a person or by a particular topic. But I think they saw that, I was trying to approach this in as fair a way as possible, and really didn't have any axe to grind, didn't have an agenda. Of course, I wasn't connected to the wrestling business, didn't know anyone in the business, started off with precisely zero contacts, which could have been looked at as a negative, but actually, in terms of what I'm talking about, that acted as a positive, because people said, yeah, he's not really connected with anyone. It doesn't seem like there's anything nefarious going on. He's just a guy asking questions. He wants to know what happened. And so I think word spread, and so in terms of reluctance, there really wasn't that much. I will say, though, equally to your point, and I appreciate the very kind words about the writing of the book. You can have a project where you interview 10,000 people, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean the final product is going to be something that's interesting or coherent for the reader. And so I think that the real challenge comes in taking all of that data, if you like, all of that information, and turning it into an actual story. And so, again, conducting those interviews was invaluable, but at the same time, pairing that with a lot of the research that I was able to do, and a lot of the supporting sort of documentation that I got access to, financial statements and memos and emails and things of that nature. The combination of all of that, I think, really helped me tell the story.
And it is such a fascinating story to tell, because the decline of WCW. I mean, I was interviewing Buff Bagwell recently on this show, and I was recalling to him how I was at London Arena for WCW Nitro taping in December 2000.
Yeah.
December 2000. So we are talking 3 months later, that company was bought out, and yet that was a packed London Arena, a solid show, rabid crowd. And it's incredible to think the sheer decline and the pace of how quickly that buyout happened, isn't it? And I think even 20 years on, we're still, as wrestling fans, slightly reeling from how it could have happened. Like, we're still like, wow, WCW was literally here, and then Vince McMahon owns it. It was remarkable, and it still to this day is, incredible. And I'm grateful for you to put in this book together, because it's put a lot of the context together of that. Like, I've heard Eric Bischoff speak multiple times about how, the corporate limitations he faced within Turner, and how there was no way that company could ultimately ever succeed. And I think the narrative that you've managed to put together here is that ultimately it didn't matter how well WCW did, its kind of time was ultimately marked.
Well, yeah, I think what you said there is very insightful, and it speaks to something that you would see, especially back then in the wrestling business, where there would be this perceptible delay between the state of a particular company's business and the attendance figures, or some of the metrics that you would use to evaluate the business. So, what I'm getting at is, it's quite ironic. WCW really started to venture outside the United States in the final few months of its existence as a company, which was, there was the UK tour, there was the Australia tour. And unfortunately, this was at a point that was far past the peak, right? But of course, these shows would have been initially proposed and discussed and organized when actually the state of WCW's business would have been a lot better, right? It wasn't like today, where you can announce that you're going to Wembley, a few months in advance, and use, the internet and social media and so forth to drive ticket sales. Much different environment back then. Things happened at a much slower pace. Word traveled a lot slower as well. There was still the novelty factor of an American wrestling company coming to a place like the UK. But yes, it happened at a time far past the peak, but also quite near to the end. But you would often see back then, if you think about the WWF, for example, when it was having its lean period, sort of around 1995, when things weren't going very well in the United States, how many times did they go to Germany? How many times did they take them over to Europe to kind of shore up the balance sheet a little bit because, hey, we're not drawing domestically, but we know if we go overseas, we're going to be a novelty and we can at least do that for a period of time. And it's interesting to think about had WCW had survived, would that have been part of the strategy possibly in 2001, 2002, as it tried to rebuild its audience in the United States? Hey, let's tap into our UK market, our Australian market. Let's actually commit to doing a series of shows in Canada, which they never really did, bizarrely having Bret Hart on the roster. So that's something that may have happened, and it's interesting to think about, but of course they never got that chance.
Hey guys, it is Hardcore Country and 11-time Women's World Champion Mickie James. And gentlemen, we have a problem. Recent studies have shown that testosterone levels are falling in men across the globe. Low testosterone is linked to depression, low sex drive, and weight gain, so it's really important to stay on top of it. Now, you could go to a TRT clinic, but let's face it, it's expensive, awkward, and most cases not even necessary. You just need to stimulate your body's own natural testosterone production. That's why it's time to check out the ultimate test stack at LegacySubs.com. The majority of testosterone release occurs while you sleep, which is why the ultimate test stack features our best-selling sleep aid, Recovery PM. So Test X9 stimulates testosterone, T-Assist inhibits estrogen, and Recovery PM gives you the best night's sleep you've ever had. You're gonna feel like a new man after trying the ultimate test stack for 30 days, I guarantee. And if you don't believe me, check out all the verified 5-star reviews on Top Rated. Legacy Sports Nutrition is founded by myself and my husband, 3-time world champion and SmackDown general manager, Nick Aldis. We personally use these products ourselves, and if you need more assurance, they are NSF certified, third-party lab tested, and made in the USA in an FDA-inspected facility. And because you listen to this show, you can save 10% off your entire order at LegacySubs.com now by using the code WrestlingLife at checkout. That's WrestlingLife, all caps, don't forget, and LegacySubs.com, LegacySupps.com. It's time to level up with Legacy.
No, and there's a lot of what ifs, and there's a lot of heartbreaking moments in this book, really, and in WCW story, because I think as wrestling fans, we may have all bought into the Monday Night Wars, but no one really wanted WWF or WCW to go under, because we all recognised that those two going head to head was creating the very best content possible, which is ultimately what we all wanted as an audience. And there's some really heartbreaking moments in here, like, for example, a lot of kind of Eric Bischoff's ideas when he was talking about doing a complete reset of the brand. So when he was hoping to buy it out himself, and it would go off air for a couple of months and re-emerge in May 2001. There's the period of the year before where Eric and Vince Russo kind of teamed up and they stripped everyone of the belts and started afresh. Like, there's these real moments where you just thought, just if only one of these ideas really could have landed, but it was all unfortunately too little too late, really, from a business standpoint, and the writing was on the wall. But I think as fans, I think that's probably one of the reasons why there's still such a desire to read about this, and why I guess people are hopeful AEW can fill that void of WCW to a degree, and that we can have real competition, because no one really wants a monopoly in wrestling. It doesn't benefit anyone. I mean, in that same interview I had with Buff, he was saying about, at the time, even when WCW was beating WWF for 83 consecutive weeks, they may have been high-fiving Eric, but at the same time, behind his back, they were all kind of saying, we don't want to beat the WWF, because if we beat the WWF, we don't have any options, and we don't have any leverage. So I think even at the time, people recognised that a monopoly wasn't going to be good for the industry, as the last 20 years have shown.
It's interesting, isn't it, to use an expression that we're familiar with in the UK. It's interesting how the goalposts moved over time, because, if you think about this entire story and you go and read the NITRO book, you'll see that at one point the goal was, hey, we've got to make this company profitable. right? So there was no real sort of notions that we're going to be the last company standing and we're going to put Vince McMahon out of business. It was, if we can just make this division profitable within Turner Broadcasting, or at least recognized the same, then we're doing a hell of a job. Then it went to, quite naturally, we want to be the number one show on Monday nights on cable television. We're in a direct ratings competition with the WWF. Why wouldn't you want to do that? Well, of course, that goal was achieved. But then I think once the sort of standard became, well, it's not enough now to be profitable or to be number one, but actually we have to put these guys out of business. Realistically, it was doubtful that was ever going to happen, number one. And also, as you mentioned, there was going to be a natural reluctance on the part of the participants in the wrestling business for that to actually happen. And we saw the damaging effects of the monopoly once WCW went away. I mean, I think there was a period in which WWE's programming was this is subjective, but was so poor that the fans were also were almost in the position of sort of being hostage to it. Like, we know this is bad, we know it's never going to be what it was in the past, but I'm a wrestling fan, and so I guess I'm just going to tune in and hope that there's something to get behind, right? Until they probably F that up. But as you were saying that, it reminded me of one of the most insightful observations that I actually heard about this whole affair, which came from, believe it or not, Ed Ferrara, who was one of the Vince Russo's writing partner, essentially, in the WWF, but also when Vince Russo came over to WCW. And Ed Ferrara said once, he said it was almost like clockwork. You could set your watch to it. Essentially, every 3 months for the last 18 months of WCW being around, there was this huge upheaval, this huge reset, where for a while there was a sense of optimism that this could be what it takes to turn us around. And ultimately, it never happened. And I'll just run through those real quick for you. So October 99, Vince Russo and Ed Ferrara come in, right? October 99, and it's the powers that be, it's the new creative regime. These guys that, the feeling was really instrumental in helping the WWF turn the tables on WCW. But then 3 months after that, January of 2000, Vince Russo is gone home. There's a booking committee in place. Kevin Sullivan's running that committee. Of course, this was the time in which the Radicals, as they became known, Chris Benoit and Eddie Guerrero and that whole group, left WCW, which really decimated the mid-card. So that was a huge change in January of 2000. Well, now we fast forward 3 months to April of 2000, and all of a sudden that's all out the window now. Eric Bischoff is back, Vince Russo is back. It's the dream team creatively. And as you mentioned, they have this crazy episode of Nitro where they literally tell the audience, forget what you've been seeing for the last 3 months. We're stripping all the belts. This is a total reset, right? Well, 3 months after that, now we're at Bash at the Beach 2000, July, and this is the famous or infamous Hogan and Jeff Jarrett match, which was recently covered on Dark Side of the Ring last year. And of course, that leads to Hogan leaving the company. Eric Bischoff goes away for a while at this point. Now we've moved forward another 3 months. It's October 2000. Vince Russo is now out. And so there's a whole different creative regime and another huge, massive shakeup going on. This is when you start having the initial rumors and talk that WCW now is actually going to be sold, right? It really sort of kicked into high gear sort of, the last quarter of 2000. 3 months after that, January of 2001, Eric Bischoff looks like he's purchased the company. So now we're told Fusion Media Ventures is here. All of this uncertainty has been put to rest. There's no more ambiguity about WCW. This is the real reset now. This is where we're going to, turn things around. And it's going to take a while, but we're ultimately going to be the number one company again. Well, almost 3 months after that, we get to March 26, 2001. It's the final episode of Nitro. Vince McMahon has bought the company, and WCW, is sold and closes its doors. So when you take in all of that, it's difficult to imagine a scenario in which you could have established any kind of continuity, or you could have established any sort of pervasive feeling that let's stick to the plan. Let's not try to turn this around in 1 week, which obviously WCW became infamous for. Let's not just throw everything at the audience in a desperate attempt to get back the audience. Let's commit to this, and it's going to take us a while, but in time, we could be back on top. how could you possibly make that argument or develop that sentiment when, every 3 months you're having these massive changes? Because naturally, if you're in that position working for the company, you're probably thinking, all right, this is what these guys want to do this week, but I know, give it another 10, 12 weeks and there's going to be some huge change. So I guess we'll just roll with it, right? It's just unbelievable how many different directions the company went in those last 18 months. I mean, you could almost write a book just about those 18 months, and maybe one day someone will.
I imagine you're burned out on writing about that period, though.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, I've heard that Guantanamo Bay, when they're running out of material to show the people there, they just put on a loop of WCW episodes from about October '99 onwards.
Brutal. Look, one of the things I really loved about the book, and I don't mean this just because it's grounded in that period that I find fascinating, but also because as a 35-year wrestling fan now who really appreciates this art form and has always felt that I have to defend it to naysayers, I really like some of the academic studies that are referenced in here. There's one that jumped out at me from Mississippi State University, Dr. Andy Gillantine, and he's talking about WCW house show attendance, and he says, and I'll quote this: "The consumer of professional wrestling is middle class, family oriented, economically stable, and able to make informed consumer decisions. The average wrestling fan looks a whole lot like your neighbor or the person you see in the mirror every day." And, really encouraging to see that, because I think this is something that we struggle with, and maybe less so now that wrestling has become slightly more accepted in mainstream for sports entertainment. But there's always been this perception that a wrestling fan is your kind of lowest common denominator. Well, actually, there's so many incredibly rich elements to professional wrestling storytelling and the art form and the people that are involved, that I've always felt that it's a very overlooked industry in terms of what it offers. And you never see this kind of scrutiny applied to cinema or to theatre or to literature. But professional wrestling has always, I guess because of its roots in the carnival days, has always had this perception that it's appealing to, a lower kind of IQ. And I was there's another piece that you cite in there. You're talking about, Dick Cheatham, and I know you could probably write a whole book about Dick Cheatham. But he references he was working for Turner Broadcasting, and he was at the doctor's office, and the doctor turns around to him and says, "Is the Hall and Nash invasion legit?" Yeah. I mean, that just kind of underscores, doesn't it, just how unbelievably not only over that NWO storyline was, but also how much it kind of, in that period of wrestling, it was so mainstream, wasn't it? With the NWO, Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Rock, all that kind of time period was the time when wrestling was just everywhere, wasn't it? It's fascinating.
It's funny you say that. I remember last year I met someone. I was taking my son to the park actually, and I was talking to another parent, and he said, I heard you're a writer. You've wrote about a bunch of things, and you wrote a book about wrestling, right? And I said, yeah, I did a book about WCW. And he said, oh, yeah, I think I've heard of that. Yeah. And then a couple of beats went by, and he said, so whatever happened to that Goldberg then? Is he still wrestling, or is he still involved? And we talked about that for a little bit. And he said, what about Kevin Nash and Scott Hall then? Are they still knocking around? Are they still involved in the business? And we talked about that for a little bit. And he said, Eric Bischoff was quite a creative guy, wasn't he? He came up with a lot of ideas. And I remember Kevin Sutton, and I swear to you, in the course of that 20 minutes, I think he named the entire WCW roster, right?
I love that. So by the end, you're on to kind of Chuck Palumbo and Queeby, aren't you?
Right. It's like, my favorite match on Worldwide was, so I finally turned to him and I said, oh, so you're a bit of a fan, were you? And to make a long story short, it came out that this guy basically, he goes to every major event there is, whether it's a WrestleMania or a SummerSlam or a Royal Rumble to this day, right? This guy's like a massive fan. So you come across this quite a lot. I think another nice story that's mentioned in the book is DDP walking through the airport, and he says, someone came up to him and said, I just want to let you know you're my hero. And DDP said, oh, it's nice to meet you. What's your name? And the guy says, oh, I'm Dr. So-and-so, and I think it turned out that he was a surgeon of some description. And Page sort of had this realization like, wow, this guy, operates on people and I'm his hero. So, yeah, I think, it's it's interesting because, in the era that we're in now, where everything has become so fragmented, there's really not the same sense of a common culture like we would have had when perhaps you and I were growing up, where you could pretty much set your watch that if there was something going on one of the major terrestrial TV channels, for example, in the UK, you could go to school the next day or go to work, and there's a fairly good chance probably everyone at least saw it or had some awareness of it. And now we're sort of, everyone's in their own silos and obviously has the ability to dictate what they're going to consume. And there's certainly a lot of positives that come along with that. But I think because things have become so fragmented, there's probably more of an acceptance and an acknowledgement of the fact that there are just innumerable subcultures now, it seems like, that are, to those people who are interested in it, just the biggest things in the world. I mean, how many times do you see something trending on Twitter or X or whatever we're supposed to call it now, where there's a million people talking about it, and you say to yourself, "I've never heard of this band,"
Yeah.
and they're in Times Square, and there's 100,000 people there or whatever, or everyone's watching this television show, and I didn't even know it existed. So I think wrestling has probably benefited from that. But again, I think, as it's mentioned in the book, wrestling is one of those things that demonstrates kind of the opposite of what they call PBS syndrome, right? Or another way of looking at it is, you could say C-SPAN syndrome, right? So in the States on C-SPAN, you'll see the hearings that take place, in the House and the Senate. And if you talk to people about how much do you follow politics, they'll say, "Oh yeah, I tune into C-SPAN and watch all of it. I watch all the debates. I watch all the bills that are being proposed." But in reality, hardly anyone actually does, right? Well, wrestling is the opposite of that. So many people will sort of give the front, I suppose, that they're not interested in it. But when you dig beneath the surface, you'll actually find out that wrestling fans come from all walks of life, and they're everywhere. And I think, wasn't it Jerry Jarrett who called it Shakespeare for the masses? And I think that's a pretty apt description of what wrestling can be when it's done correctly.
So tell me about your relationship with Eric Bischoff then, because I mean, he's always talked about, as I said earlier, he's always talked about the limitations he faced from a corporate standpoint in WCW. You worked with him, and he's referenced a lot in this book, and you've given a very fair and balanced account of, the wider corporate environment that he found himself in. How did your relationship with Eric develop as you were writing this book, and how did that ultimately lead to you writing his book, as I mentioned at the start, Grateful, which I've got here as well?
Well, I appreciate you picking that up also. It's quite interesting because, again, I'm very grateful, if we could use that word, that Eric agreed to be interviewed in the first place for the book. I think he gave me about 4.5 hours of his time over a couple of different days, and I really tried to focus on subjects that he hadn't talked about to death. At this point, it's quite interesting now because you think about all the wrestling podcasts that have popped up. But at this point, everyone was pretty much sick of the Monday Night Wars. It was almost like there's nothing left to be said. How many different times are we going to regurgitate the same stories? And so I thought, if I have the chance to get him on the phone, knowing that he's done 10,000 interviews about this, I don't want to say, "So tell me, how did Nitro come about then in the first place? Wasn't there a meeting with you and Ted?" Like, we're not gonna go over old ground, right? So I think we had a good couple of interviews initially for the book, but that was the extent of my communication with Eric. So the book came out, and I assumed that at some point he was going to read it, or someone was going to clue him in as to what the book was all about. But I didn't know that for sure. But I'll never forget, it was about 5 or 6 weeks after the book came out, and all of a sudden I woke up one day and I was just getting emails and messages, and Amazon was going crazy, and it was clear something had happened, right? Because the book, I was lucky that almost from the start, the book was received extremely well, and it was already building a lot of momentum. People were discovering it. They were talking about it. We were already sort of on that road. But what gave it rocket fuel, I think, was one day when Eric and Conrad got on 83 Weeks and just gave this glowing, assessment of the book, and blew me away with how they described it. I mean, honestly, because I had no idea that was going to happen. also keeping in mind that if you or I were in Eric's shoes and we're reading a book about a company that we were heavily involved in, and there's some content in that book that doesn't really portray us in the most positive light and may even be embarrassing at times, would you or I have the character to say, you know what, that was tough to read at times, but it's fair. That's what actually happened, and people need to go read the story. That's what Eric did. And so I really thought that was just so commendable and so rare, because you don't come across a lot of people in life, period, who would do something like that, especially when there's no benefit for them, right? Again, we can sit here and say, yeah, I would do the same thing. I would be man enough to divorce myself from that. But our natural human tendency would be to say, this is a bunch of bullshit. Don't believe this crap that they're talking about me. So I think, once that happened, and then Eric and I subsequently met at the first Starcast in Chicago, and he said the exact same thing to me in person. He said, I got to hand it to you. You did an amazing job, and it's what happened, and he said, I just want to shake your hand. And we ended up doing a panel then at the second Starcast in Vegas, which I was so thankful, for Conrad and his whole team to put on, which was really based around the NITRO book in part. And I guess we got to talking after that panel, and we kind of said, if there's a chance for us to work together on something, maybe we should explore it. Well, shortly after that, he ended up going back to WWE, if you remember, for that very short tenure. So I think at that point I thought, okay, this is something I'm going to have to revisit in a few years, because he's probably going to be tied up with WWE now for a long period of time. Well, obviously that didn't last very long. So we revisited it and knocked around a couple of different ideas, but ultimately settled on, let's just pick up the story from Controversy Creates Cash, because a lot of stuff has happened in your life in this 15-year or so period, not just as it relates to wrestling, and all of that content is in there, all of the TNA stuff and the things people want to read about, but just the journey that he's been on, I think, in terms of, having so many business successes, but also some very drastic failures, and filing for bankruptcy, and being in a position where, he and his wife and his family more broadly were in quite a bit of, difficulty when it came to money. And so having the opportunity to work with him on Grateful was just fantastic. And I think, as having read the book, you'll see that in the same way that he was very honest about his assessment of the NITRO book, he was very honest about himself in Grateful as well. This isn't just chapter after chapter of Eric, in wrestling parlance, putting himself over and, deflecting blame from certain things and talking about, what a genius he was in all circumstances. There's many aspects of this where he's really engaging in a lot of self-reflection, putting his hand up and saying, I was to blame there, I messed up, here's how I learned from it. And ultimately, the way that the book ends is with him being in this mindset, which I think is quite genuine today for the most part, which is looking back on this crazy journey that he's been on in his life and, saying, yeah, there were some crazy highs, there were some really bad lows, but wow, I'm so grateful that it actually happened. So we don't beat you over the head with it. It doesn't start that way and continue that way throughout the entire book. If you've heard Eric on his podcast at times tear into people, he's going to do that in the book as well. Rest assured. But ultimately, it ends up in a really, really nice place. And that wasn't something that we manufactured. That was genuinely something that came out as a result of our conversations. And personally, I was happy to be a part of that, because like yourself, I sort of have the mindset that there's enough negativity out there when it comes to wrestling and the content that's produced about it. That's not to say it can't be entertaining at times, but how nice is it to actually end up a story on a happy note, right? The final chapter wasn't, well, my life's in ruins. It was, I'm in my late 60s and I'm looking forward to what's coming ahead. And I just think that's really refreshing, especially in this day and age.
It's Ben Veal here, host of Wrestling Life. This show is all about real talk from the talented individuals who shaped wrestling's past, present and future. And when it comes to honouring wrestling's past, I have to give a quick shout out to the great team and our friends at bigbluecage.com. Big Blue Cage Wrestling Store is your one-stop online shop for some truly awesome wrestling gear. Big Blue Cage's replica championship belts includes the very best designs from the Golden Era, New Generation and the Attitude Era, including the much beloved Winged Eagle belt, the iconic Intercontinental Championship, which in my humble opinion is the greatest belt design of all time, the Attitude Era Big Eagle, and even the Big Gold belt, all available either in CNC or deep hand-etched plates and with real leather straps. And that's not all. Big Blue Cage are also the exclusive stockists of other old school items that I absolutely love, including WWF, WCW and old school Hasbro sock sets, and the one accessory that every wrestling fan's car needs, Hulk Hogan and Macho Man Randy Savage wiper blades. It's time for the mega powers to explode once again. With UK and worldwide delivery options available and custom designs accepted, head on over now to bigbluecage.com. You know, it is. And some of the conversations I've had recently, you know, with WCW alumni, so with Mark Mera, with Lodi, with Buff Bagwell, I mean, it's been really encouraging to speak with individuals who have all had their dark periods, but have all come out the other side. And it's a curious thing with wrestling, because this medium, which is ultimately designed to provide escapism and joy to us and to take us away from our real lives, there also seems to be this kind of Schadenfreudian kind of desire to see the mighty fall. And these people have brought great joy to me. And I don't take any joy from seeing someone enter rehab or go through tough times, or, you know, all the kind of stories we hear about a lot of these wrestlers after the bright lights have faded. I only want good things for those people that have brought me entertainment. And so I think whilst there's a desire, obviously, isn't there, to hear the inside scoop of, what happened there, and you know, the fan in us wants that, to know the behind the scenes piece. What I really enjoyed about Grateful, and what I've really enjoyed about listening to Eric on 83 Weeks, has been, he strikes me as someone who's really enjoying life now. And when I talk about life, I'm talking about the pure wonderful parts of life. So like this cover says it all, kind of nature, his dog, a nice cup of coffee on his veranda in the morning, a sunset, time with his wife. And it was really interesting reading the book, because I was really surprised. He seemed to be so settled and at peace with himself. And then suddenly he gets approached by WWE out of the blue in 2019, completely upends this, what is essentially quite a nice retired life, to go back into the fire of corporate WWE. And we all know that it didn't last very long. But from your conversations with Eric, what do you think it was that drew him back to that crazy industry when he seemed quite settled at that point in his life?
Well, I think it was more of a case of, for whatever reason at that time, WWE felt like he would be the appropriate person to be in that new role as the executive director for SmackDown at the time. If you remember, this is when, you know, the big announcement was made that Paul Heyman's going to be in a similar role for Raw. And, you know, quite unbelievable, really, when you think about this was 2019. It was 18 years since ECW and WCW. And it was almost like, wow, okay, so we've got, you know, Vince McMahon, Paul Heyman, and Eric Bischoff working together in this capacity. But I think, you know, as he talks about in the book, you know, again, he's very honest as to why it doesn't work out. I mean, I know that he has a lot of feelings about it, but rather than saying, you know, these guys didn't give me a chance, I was, you know, hitting the ball out of the park, and they just decided to send me home after 4 months. Again, he puts his hand up and basically says, and, you know, people have to read about it, but basically reflects on maybe what, from his standpoint, some of his shortcomings may have been. And I think what you just said there in terms of setting up the question probably also gives us the answer, in terms of he was in a completely different mindset. His daily routine was very different than it had been running WCW in the 90s. He was at a much different point in his life. And so all of a sudden, to move to the other side of the country and live in a completely different environment and be subject to those corporate pressures and not be your own boss for the first time in many, many years, you know, that would be a rough transition for anybody. So, you know, I think that's it's one of those footnotes that sort of gets lost to history now. I think you can often forget, and even I do sometimes, that even happened, because it was just such a short period of time. Yeah. But again, I think he does give you the inside scoop. He does tell you about some of the things that were said behind the scenes, and some of the blow-ups he had with Vince, but also, you know, is pretty reflective about it also.
I mean, you mentioned fever dreams earlier, like the fact that it was only 2019, but Paul Heyman, Eric Bischoff, and Vince McMahon were leading WWE is bonkers. But do you think there was a desire as well from Eric? Because obviously he didn't get to finish the WCW story on his own terms. Then he came back to WWE as a talent, which he seemed very much at peace with. But do you think there was a desire from him to kind of bookend his career creatively and be that Midas touch for WWE?
I mean, I'm sure there was. I mean, I'm sure, him being, the prideful person he is, he obviously didn't want it to only last for 4 months. I'm sure he would have, loved to go on there and really make an impact, but I don't think he ever really did. I mean, if you look at, how many shows that he really had a fingerprint on, it was just a couple, really, right? You're talking about October 2019 when SmackDown moved over to Fox. And I'd have to go back and check the book, but I'm pretty sure in saying after the second show is when he was removed from the position. So obviously there was a bit of time leading up to that, but it wasn't like he had the opportunity to at least, showcase 12 months of work. I think he was still very much in a position of learning the system and becoming familiar with the personnel, and not going in there like a bull in a china shop, but sort of observing things and picking and choosing where he could have an impact. But sure, I'm sure that going in, he undoubtedly had a desire to prove that he could do it again. Ultimately, I do think that it ended up quite nicely for him in terms of the Hall of Fame induction happening, which again, you talk about things that you probably couldn't have imagined back in the mid to late 90s, WWE actually acknowledging Eric Bischoff in that kind of fashion. And, Eric tells a story in the book, which I don't think he's told anywhere else before, about what Vince McMahon told him just before. And again, now a lot of things have come out about Vince McMahon, so we could, it colors a lot of stories from the past, right? So let's just leave that there. But he tells a story about Vince, pulling him aside and sort of sharing some very heartfelt words on sort of Eric's impact in the business, which based on our interpretation of that relationship is pretty interesting to hear about. And so ultimately, I think things did wind up in a positive direction. But you have to wonder as well how much of the thought process was influenced by the fact that AEW had just announced its television deal, right? So in other words, was some of the thinking driven in part by, there's a couple of guys, and Eric Bischoff is one of them, who are out there right now. We've got this upstart company, and at this time, all we know about them is there's a billionaire in Shah Khan, backing them, and they've got a television deal, and they've already signed, some pretty heavy hitters, and they're throwing money around. Let's see if we can cut them off at the pass and maybe do something that will be of detriment to their business. That's just speculation on my part, but logically, I think if you look at the timeline, there's probably something to that.
I'm glad you referenced AEW, because I kind of wanted to end up this conversation with asking you that question as someone who has spent so many countless hours working on the story of Nitro and has learned a lot about the ups and downs of that business model. Are there some kind of a lot of parallels have been drawn between WCW's heyday and the incredibly swift rise of AEW, and whether or not it's sustainable, and whether already that organization might be struggling in some of the ways creatively that WCW did. I preface this at the start by saying I want nothing but the best for every promotion that's out there, for all the talents working with them. I want AEW to thrive. I want WWE to thrive, because it all creates a better product. Do you think there's any kind of cautionary elements from your time working on Nitro that AEW should heed in terms of mistakes to avoid? Or do you think we're talking about two very, very different beasts here because of the structure corporately of AEW?
Well, I think we could answer this question in a number of different ways. I think AEW is going to continue to exist for as long as the Khan family are willing to lose money on it, quite frankly. I think it's as much of a business proposition as it is a philanthropic one, which is, hey, there's a situation here where at the time there was only one dominant wrestling company, there's a monopoly. We have the ability, or I have the ability, speaking of Tony Khan, to remedy that. and I'm willing to invest an enormous amount of money to make that possible, and I don't necessarily have the pressures of turning a profit. Well, that probably can continue ad infinitum, I would imagine, as long as Tony Khan and the Khan family in general are willing to finance it, right? You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the general understanding is that AEW has yet to turn a profit. I think one of the things that sort of supports that notion is if they had turned a profit, we would have definitely heard about it. There would have definitely been a number of press releases, press conferences, and so on and so forth. I think that would have been shouted from the rooftops. So I think it's fairly safe to say that the company has not been profitable. And so, in terms of comparing it to WCW obviously being part of Turner Broadcasting and then being subject to 2 corporate mergers was never in a comparable situation. In a corporate structure like that, you can have divisions that are profitable and are successful that don't end up lasting. And of course, that wasn't the case with WCW. They were losing a ton of money towards the end. But the general principle is that you don't ultimately have a full degree of control over your destiny, which AEW does, right? Unless there's some kind of massive shakeup as it relates to the ownership, or they start to explore a different model. And so, I think there's some positive elements that come along with that, and there's some negative elements as well, because I think what's great for the wrestling business is the fact that now you have this alternative company, you have a lot of people making a very good living from it. And of course, fans have benefited from some amazing moments that have taken place over the last few years, Punk's return, the Wembley show, so on and so forth, some great matches and storylines. But I would argue when you don't have the pressure of actually turning a profit, in other words, when you're not really constrained by reality in a technical sense, in the strictest sense, that's going to lead to a lot of waste. That's going to lead to a lot of inefficiencies. That's going to lead to a lot of developments that are not necessarily in the best interest of the business. And it's not difficult to see why that might be the case. If you think about, if you and I went into business, Ben, and we were going to open, we were going to open a restaurant, right? And we had just an endless amount of funds to pull from, and we didn't necessarily have the demands of turning a profit. Are we going to run our restaurant with the same level of efficiency as our competitors who actually do have that demand every month of meeting payroll and not overspending in relation to what they're bringing in, right? Yeah. Probably not. We would probably resort to doing a lot of gimmicks and doing a lot of things, in an attempt to pull people from our competitors that maybe long-term wouldn't be the best thing for us. So I'm kind of giving you a nuanced answer here. And hopefully, everyone can kind of pick up on what I'm saying. I think overall, of course, it's been a huge positive to the wrestling business. I mean, the fact that the business, as we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, is in the position it's in, you have to give an awful lot of credit to that. You have to give an awful lot of the credit to AEW for that, because just look at what's happened since its inception in 2019. But also, I think Nick Khan is, famous for being on the record as saying anyone can run a business at a loss. And I think, the challenge is going to be, can they actually put the company in a position where it's going to be profitable, put themselves, even if it's artificially, under a set of circumstances where they're going to be subject to the same pressures, realities, and conditions as wrestling companies of the past, right? People may have perceived WCW to be in that position because of Turner's backing, right? Yeah. But it never really was, by virtue of that, complicated corporate structure, and the fact that, as it's discussed in the book, revenues and expenses would be very liberally moved around from division to division. So there's no real reliable accounting, and we do show you the accounting in the book, but no real reliable accounting of exactly how profitable is our wrestling division, right? A lot of that stuff, for political reasons, was being moved around. So WCW was really never in that position, although more than certainly, other wrestling promotions of the past. But I suppose that's a long-winded way of saying what I would really like to see, I think, for the best interest of AEW as a business and the wrestling business as a whole, is some of those inefficiencies to be cut out. They don't have to go out and sign every single person who comes off the WWE roster, right? They've got to get back, in my opinion, an outsider looking in, they've got to get back to actually being that alternative. We heard a lot about the sports-based presentation, I think, back in 2019. I'm not really sure what's happened with that. And the cold hard fact is they drew 1.4 million viewers for the first episode in 2019. When we're comparing numbers to the 90s, there's a whole set of extraneous factors that color that discussion, and it's very difficult to do that. Even though cord cutting has accelerated over the last few years, I would argue that 2019 is not quite as different from 2024 as people may think. Therefore, we're still in a position where they haven't exceeded the audience of that first show. And so I think when I'll really start getting interested again is when they're approaching that audience and when they can get back to, I think, what it was that made them unique in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk to you about this all day, but I would personally, this is across the industry, I'd just like there to be less content. I know that's ironic as a wrestling fan, but it's just the sheer abundance of content. What made 1998 so special was you were talking about your 2 hours of WWF versus your 3 hours of WCW, and that was still a lot. That's still 5 hours a week of television. That's before SmackDown came in, Thunder, all of the different offshoots. There's just too much. And for me, I've got about, and I say this as someone who lives and breathes wrestling and runs a wrestling show, but I've got a finite a number of hours of wrestling in me in a week. I've got kids, I've got work, I've got a life. I want to do other things other than watch wrestling. And I think the sooner that wrestling promoters can realize there really is actually an oversaturated audience, we actually need, but less is more, the better. But then equally, every single one of those minutes links to ad spend. And when you're producing, I think lots of these businesses now are just content creators, much more than they are wrestling companies or TV shows.
I think so, but you have to also wonder at the same time, long term, what the implications are of that, to your point, because if you think about the perception of AEW when it launched, I think one of the things they benefited from was having these big shows fairly well spread apart, where wrestling fans from across the country and even across the world could come and attend. And so from in terms of its perception, it created this idea that this company right from the start is a big deal. I went to that first show, I went to All In, I went to that first show in Vegas, right? And it was impressive. I mean, you looked around and you said, if this is what they're doing to start, where is this company going to be going moving forward, right? But you're right. Now we're in a position where there's a new show on the air, I guess, every 72 hours, and so it's just very, very difficult to bring to develop that same anticipation, I think.
And I was at, I've got the cat behind me. I was at All In last year at Wembley Stadium. Incredible, being surrounded by, questionable how many people were there. Was it 70,000? Was it 75? Was it 80? It was a lot of people, regardless, and it was a great show. But the second that the show ended and Tony Khan came out in the ring and said, "We'll see you all again exactly in 12 months' time," immediately I was like, "Oh, this doesn't feel anywhere near as special now." Like it immediately lost something. I was like, "Oh, we're doing this each year, are we?" And I think there's something to be said for the novelty. But circling back to what we said, I want them to do well. I want them to succeed, and I don't want another WCW situation. And let's hope that we can continue in a situation where we do have, big US promotions competing against one another, plus all of the great promotions that are worldwide, to give talent as many opportunities as they can to ply their trade. Because at the end of the day, that's what we want as fans, isn't it?
Yeah, I think I don't see any end, in the near horizon or at any point really for AEW. I think if you look at what we know about Tony Khan, at least, this is a guy that does, in fact, live and breathe and sleep wrestling. And so it's difficult to imagine a scenario in which at any point he would say, yeah, I'm tired of this. I'm tired of putting together these shows and signing this talent. So I wouldn't be surprised if 50 years from now, AEW is still going. And the only question really is, for how long can they continue to lose money and at what pace until the Khan family says, we're actually perhaps better served, getting into a different business. I don't know. But I do think it does keep you honest when it's like in your household, right? If you're sticking to a budget every month, it's going to keep you honest. There's some things you can do, there's some things you can't do. if you try to live like that, nothing is beyond your reach and nothing is beyond your means, very quickly you're probably going to get yourself in a little bit of trouble, and you're also going to do some things you probably shouldn't be doing. So we'll see what happens with that.
We'll see. Well, look, I want to round this off by asking Guy, what's next? Because I saw you put out a post recently saying that a new book is underway. So what can we expect from you?
Thanks for asking that, Ben. I just want to say I really appreciate the time as well, and it's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Hopefully you're welcome. I hope we can do it again, because I could literally talk to you about this stuff all day. I mean, look, we've spoken for over an hour. We haven't even got onto the legend of Dick Cheatham, so that's a whole podcast in itself, isn't it?
So that will be the next conversation. Then we'll start there. But no, thank you very much, and thank you for everyone for listening. By the time you hear this, we would have actually announced the next book that I've been working on, which is a very, very unique and very special project, I think, because it's a combination autobiography, and also, I don't even know how to describe it really. It's a project I've been working on with David Penzer, who was the ring announcer with WCW, and we're telling his whole story of his involvement, not only in the wrestling business, but really his life story from the beginning up until actually the end of WCW is where we finish off. And that's fascinating, by the way. I mean, David has so many insights in this book, which he has never talked about in any form or fashion in any podcast or interviews. And, he happens to live about 20 minutes away from me. So I've had the benefit of talking to him very regularly and getting to know him very well. And he's really opened up to a level that I really didn't expect, and made for a fantastic book. So it's a wonderful story, I would argue, first and foremost. But we've also supplemented the story with, we talked about a lot of the materials which made their way into the NITRO book, the show formats, the scripts, the memos, things of that nature. Well, it turns out that David actually held on to a ton of this stuff from his WCW days. Because he wasn't just a ring announcer. He wore a number of hats behind the scenes. Over time, his responsibility grew and grew. He was actually on the booking committee at the end of the company. So he was one of these people that stored all this stuff away, probably thinking it might come in handy one day. And so, I was able to, talk to him about getting some of this stuff out of storage. And the sort of back third of the book is all made up of those materials which have never been seen before, which really put you in the position of working there behind the scenes in WCW. If you ever wanted to see what was written down before the episode of David Arquette winning the world title, you can see it in there, for example. All that kind of stuff is in there. So, originally we had talked about doing kind of a scrapbook, which I know other people in wrestling have done. We said, let's put in some of these scripts and materials and clippings and photos that you have. But the more I spoke with David, I said, you've got such an interesting story. We need to tell that as well. So it kind of turned into two books in one. Other than that, at the time that people are listening to this, there's going to be something coming up on television, as a matter of fact, in very short order, which people are going to be really interested in, which I was involved in, and some other stuff throughout 2024 as well. But that's the main thing. If this is being heard in April of 2024, go on Amazon or GuyEvansBooks.com. It's called David Penzer. It's called, Sitting Ringside with David Penzer. It's volume 1 of 2 because he has so much stuff. We've actually had to do 2 books, but you can go and order that now, and hopefully we can talk about that as well next time.
I'd love that. And just for my audience, just to finish up. So, if anyone watching on YouTube, these are the two books, Grateful and NITRO. You can see them there. What are your socials, Guy? How can people connect with you?
Sure. So you can follow me at Guy Evans Books on Twitter/X. That's probably the best way to get in touch. We also have a Twitter account for the book. It's at WCW Nitro Book. So from time to time, we'll post things relating to the book and different things that we may come across over time. And you can also just shoot me an email for the people listening. My email address is guyevanswcwbook@gmail.com. And I would just say, if you enjoyed the Nitro book and you enjoyed Grateful, I'm certain that you will love this new book with David Penzer and everything else in the pipeline as well. So again, really appreciate everyone listening, and thank you, Ben, for the time.
Oh, you're welcome, Guy. Well, look, thank you so much for this great conversation. I love having conversations like this. We'll definitely do it again. On the subject of thanks, thank you to my producer, Jeff Easton from Tall Lake Productions for bringing Wrestling Life to life. Thank you to all of us for joining us. As always, shows like this rely on your support, so please use the hashtag Wrestling Life Pod and follow us on socials at Wrestling Life Online. We'll be back soon for more real talk from real talent. So until then, be good to each other. I'll see you all soon. Bye.